this video, we're going to go through the free will and moral responsibility topic. And so we're going to be looking at these 3 points from the specification: the conditions of moral responsibility, the extent of moral responsibility, and also the relevance of moral responsibility to reward and punishment. So to be held morally responsible for their actions, clearly people must be able to act through their own free will. Because if we're not free to act, then surely we can't be held responsible for what we do or do not do. To support this point, Aristotle suggested in Nicomachean Ethics that only voluntary actions, those that are freely undertaken, should qualify for praise or blame. To be held morally responsible for their actions, therefore, people must act voluntarily through their own free will. To be morally responsible, a person must also understand the difference between right and wrong. And that means, in theory, that the following groups can't be held responsible for their moral decisions and resulting actions: those who have not learned the difference between right and wrong, such as children; those who cannot understand the difference, such as those with cognitive impairment; those who have permanently forgotten the difference, such as those with dementia or with brain injury; and those who have temporarily forgotten the difference between right and wrong, such as those under the influence of alcohol or drugs. So there are 3 different perspectives on free will: hard determinism, libertarianism, and compatibilism. And all 3 of these have implications for the extent to which we can be held morally responsible for our actions. So hard determinism is the first view. It's the view that all human decisions and actions are the direct result of previous actions and decisions. This means that everything has a cause, and this idea is known as the principle of universal causation. Hard determinism stems from the idea that the universe operates according to a regular, predictable pattern as described by the laws of physics. This view can be supported by reductionism, an approach that argues if we reduce everything down to its smallest parts, then the complex is really just a collection of simple parts. If human behaviour can be reduced to elements that are governed by physics, then it is determined. The philosopher Baruch Spinoza argued that when human beings believe they have free will, it's because they are actually ignorant of the truth. We are ignorant of all the factors that have led up to this moment, and this ignorance leads us to mistakenly think that we have free will. As Spinoza said, in the mind there is no absolute or free will, but the mind is determined to will this or that by a cause, which has been determined by another cause, and this last by another cause, and so on until infinity. The philosopher John Locke had a similar view, illustrated through his famous locked room analogy. Imagine if a man wakes up in his room and decides to stay in bed rather than leave the room. However, unbeknownst to him, the door to his bedroom has been locked. He lies in bed under the illusion that he is free to leave at any time he chooses, but actually he cannot. His feeling that he is free to leave the room is just an illusion brought about by ignorance of the full facts of his situation. This, of course, also connects back to Plato's allegory of the cave. Now, there are 3 forms of hard determinism that it's helpful to be aware of, although you can't be asked specifically about one of these in the exam. We're going to talk about scientific, psychological, and theological forms of hard determinism now. So scientific hard determinism is the view that the universe is mechanistic and operates like a machine. Everything can be traced back to the Big Bang and proceeded from there in a chain of cause and effect that acts according to the laws of physics. From this perspective, all human actions are a result of the workings of the mechanistic universe. They are not freely chosen. We do not have free will because our actions are determined by physical laws. A scientist called Pierre-Simon Laplace was the first to propose scientific hard determinism. He claimed that if at any given moment in time it were possible to know both the position and the speed of all the particles in the universe, it would be possible to know their position at any other time in the past, present, or future, since the laws of physics would tell us how they got there and where they were headed next. The implication of this view is that the future is also determined, and theoretically possible to be known if we know everything there is to know about the present. Now, despite the views of scientific hard determinists such as Laplace, it's not certain that the universe really is mechanistic. It can be argued that there are no fixed laws of nature, really, as these laws just describe and explain what we have observed to date. There is no guarantee that the universe will operate in the same way moving forward in the future. Quantum physics, and specifically the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, can also be used to critique scientific hard determinism. The Heisenberg uncertainty principle states that it's not possible to measure both the position and speed of a particle at the same time, and this implies that the quantum world is not determined but is actually the result of chance and randomness. Psychological hard determinism now. According to psychological determinism, all human behaviour, thoughts and feelings are the inevitable outcome of complex psychological laws describing cause and effect relationships in human behaviour. Therefore, from this perspective, all decisions and actions can theoretically be predicted and are therefore determined. Psychological determinism has its roots in the work of Ivan Pavlov and his experiments on the digestive system of dogs. Pavlov discovered that dogs could be conditioned to behave in a certain way through the use of external stimuli. The work of Pavlov on conditioning was built upon further by B.F. Skinner, whose take on psychological determinism has become known as psychological behaviourism. Based on his experiments with rats and pigeons, Skinner concluded that when a particular response to a stimulus is rewarded, that behaviour becomes conditioned and is likely to be repeated. Equally, if a response is punished, then that behaviour is conditioned too. Skinner applied his research to human beings and concluded that all human behaviour can be seen as a conditioned response. Skinner's major contribution to the consideration of free will and morality came in 1971 with his book Beyond Freedom and Dignity. In this book, he denied the existence of intentions, purposes, aims, goals, and other internal psychological states. He attacked the idea of autonomous man and referred to human free will as an illusion. Skinner argued that human behaviour is a product of past history and current contingencies, and that therefore behaviour cannot be free in the common sense use of the term. Skinner stated that the environment determines our behaviours, including our achievements and failures. Now, the initial work of Skinner can be critiqued because it was based upon experiments with animals. Many people question whether these findings in relatively simple creatures such as pigeons and rats can really be transferable to complex creatures like human beings. Skinner's ideas about determinism were also challenged by the emergence of cognitive psychology. Cognitive psychologists argued that behaviour is not only determined by external stimuli and reinforcement, but is also influenced by internal mental processes such as perception and memory. This perspective, cognitive psychology, emphasised the role of free will and the importance of cognitive factors in shaping behaviour. Critics of Skinner's determinism have also argued that his approach overlooked the influence of social and cultural factors on human behaviour. They suggest that people's behaviour is not only determined by reinforcement and punishment, but is also shaped by social norms, cultural values, and individual free choice. Overall, critics of Skinner's psychological determinism argue that human behaviour is often far more complex and unpredictable than his deterministic model can account for. Theological hard determinism is a theological and philosophical perspective within Christian theology, which proposes that everything in the universe, including human thoughts, actions, and events, is preordained and predetermined by the one God, who is omniscient and omnipotent. This view suggests that God's divine will is the ultimate and sole cause of everything. By implication, human beings have no true free will or ability to make choices independent of God's plan. If God knows the future, then my action is already fixed in time, and therefore I am not freely choosing to act, even if it may feel as if I am. Theological determinism can be seen in the specific belief about predestination, which of course is part of the Christianity side of the AQA course as well. Remember, predestination is the idea that God has already determined from the beginning of time who will be saved and who will not be saved. If God is omniscient and omnipotent, then it seems that he knows everything and controls everything. And so, as a logical consequence, he would know and control all of human history and our ultimate fate. If this is the case, then all our actions are willed by God, and moral conduct becomes insignificant to salvation, since we have no control over it. The doctrine of predestination seems to be found in St. Paul's letter to the church in Rome. For those God foreknew, he also predestined. Those he predestined, he also called. Those he called, he also justified. Those he justified, he also glorified. Theological hard determinists argue that human beings do not possess genuine free will. They argue that our apparent choices and decisions are just illusions, since everything has already been predestined by God. Now, apart from the obvious critical point in response to theological hard determinism, that if there is no God, then there can be no theological determinism, there are also alternative ways of looking at God which might affect this issue. For example, Aquinas believed that God is beyond time. This means God sees all of history at once, and God does not cause future events, even if he knows what they are. We see this expressed in Aquinas' writing when he said, God is in the high citadel of eternity, which is all at one time. The whole course of time is subject to eternity in one simple glance. Another alternative way of looking at things is taken by process theology, the view, of course, that God exists in time. This would alter our understanding of omniscience, because God can only know what it is logically possible to know. Since the future has not happened, it can't be known. So, from this perspective, God would know the past and the present perfectly, but cannot know the future. From this view, theological hard determinism makes no sense, and there is no threat to free will. Now, critics of Christian theological hard determinism raise concerns about the implications for human moral responsibility. If everything is predetermined by God, some argue, it becomes challenging to hold individuals morally accountable for their actions. However, Christian hard determinists might respond by arguing that God's predetermined plan includes human responsibility and accountability for one's actions, as evidenced in the story of Adam and Eve. Now, is there any evidence for hard determinism? Well, during the 1980s, a neuroscientist carried out an experiment on the brain that seemed to provide conclusive evidence in support of hard determinism. Benjamin Libet's findings seemed to show that unconscious electrical impulses in the brain actually preceded conscious thoughts relating to acts of the will. This potentially means that the brain is preparing to act before we are even conscious of the decision to act, and of course that would support hard determinism. However, it's interesting to note that the neuroscientist Libet himself denied that this experiment proved hard determinism. He actually interpreted his findings as showing that although the preconscious mind has intention, the brain has the freedom to veto these intentions, which actually supports the belief in free will, rather than providing evidence in support of hard determinism. So overall, there's no conclusive evidence at present that shows hard determinism is either true or false. However, some argue that there is cumulative evidence to support hard determinism. As determinism seems multifaceted, the same idea can be explained through different disciplines, as we've just seen, so science, psychology, and theology. Now, if we move on to the opposite view to hard determinism, that's known as libertarianism. This is the view that the world is not determined and there is no universal causation. From this perspective, human beings are free and can control the actions that they choose to perform or not. Many libertarians are mind-body dualists, which means that they follow the views of Descartes and believe the mind exists independently of the body and as a separate, distinct substance. This is because if you equate the mind with the brain, then you run into the issue of reductionism. The brain can be reduced to chemical reactions and electrical impulses, and this leans towards hard determinism rather than libertarian free will. So libertarianism is the view, as we've said, that human beings have free will and can control the actions that they choose to perform. Some people argue that libertarianism is claiming that human choice is random, like flipping a coin. If this is the case, though, then moral responsibility would become an issue, because how can you ever be held morally responsible for a random act? However, a more moderate approach to libertarianism is that just because events are not determined, it does not necessarily mean they must be random. From this point of view, human decisions are controlled by the moral self and are free decisions made using free will if you could have chosen differently. This idea that you could have done otherwise is known as the principle of alternate possibilities. For example, a kleptomaniac might be inclined to steal, but this does not necessarily mean they will steal. The moral self is what freely chooses the actions. Sometimes a kleptomaniac will steal, but on other occasions they do not. So libertarianism is also not the view that we are free to literally do anything. Because let's face it, we're always limited by external factors. So we have physical limitations, psychological limitations, and social limitations. And it can also be argued that the idea of total freedom also would make no sense, because having complete free choice would essentially be quite paralysing. Most libertarians use the sensation of free will as an argument for its existence. Our experience just constantly tells us that we're freely choosing what to do and how to act. This common sense understanding of how our minds work has been given the name folk psychology. A hard determinist would argue that this feeling is just an illusion, but a libertarian might respond that the feeling that we are free is a strangely persistent illusion. Feelings of guilt or satisfaction after we make decisions don't really seem to make sense if they're not part of free decisions, and people are also able to talk through the process that led them to take a particular action or make a particular decision, which seems to further support the belief that we have free will. Now, how can libertarianism be critically analysed? Well, libertarianism rejects determinism entirely, but many argue that there is actually quite strong evidence in support of determinism from science and psychology. The laws of nature, genetics, and the environment do seem to influence what we do, making it hard to see where libertarian free will fits in. Libertarianism also struggles to explain where free will comes from. If actions are not determined by external causes or prior events, then what actually does cause them? Libertarian free will also suggests that people have total control over their actions, which some would argue could lead to unfair moral judgments. If someone's choices are entirely up to them, it might ignore the significant influence of external factors like mental health, poverty, or upbringing as factors behind why people act the way they do. Of course, for religious believers like Christians, libertarian free will also conflicts with the idea of God's omniscient nature. If God is believed to know everything, including the future, then how can humans freely be choosing what to do? Now, the third strand in understanding freedom is compatibilism. So we've talked through hard determinism and the opposite to that, which is libertarianism. And in the middle, we have this view called compatibilism. So compatibilists argue that it's actually possible to believe in both determinism and free will simultaneously. They claim that the two ideas are actually compatible and can work together. So how do they reconcile the two? Well, compatibilists typically take the view that we're free to act upon our wants and wishes, but believe that our wants and wishes have been determined by previous events and experiences. In many ways, compatibilism is perhaps best explained as doing what you want rather than choosing what you want. Now, David Hume was a compatibilist, which means, of course, he believed that free will and determinism are compatible. Hume defined freedom as being able to act upon our desires without external interference, and he referred to this as the liberty of spontaneity. Hume recognised, though, that our desires and motives are determined by our previous experiences. For Hume, free will does not mean having the ability to act completely independently of our previous experiences, but it means being able to act and make decisions without having these decisions forced upon us. Our past experiences and character cause our wills, cause what we want, but we are free to act upon those. Overall, for David Hume, human actions can be both determined and also free. The two ideas, he believed, were compatible. So compatibilism is not saying that we can theoretically choose any action we want, which is what a libertarian would say. It's saying instead that we are free to act upon what we want, so we're free from external constraints. This is the key idea. By challenging the definition of freedom as we assume it to be, compatibilists argue we can exist freely within a determined universe. This is because, as Hume argues, freedom does not mean the ability to make decisions independently of our past or totally randomly, but freedom means the ability to make decisions without these decisions being forced upon us. I am free to act upon my wants and wishes, but my wants and wishes have been determined by previous events and experiences. So Patricia Churchland is a prominent philosopher and neuroscientist, and she actually supported the compatibilist view by explaining that free will is compatible with a deterministic understanding of the brain. Churchland acknowledges that brain processes are influenced by deterministic laws, but she argues that this does not eliminate moral responsibility and freedom, because for her, moral responsibility arises when individuals are capable of understanding the consequences of their actions and can regulate their behaviour accordingly, even if the underlying brain mechanisms are deterministic. Compatibilism enables Christian beliefs about free will and the omniscience of God to be compatible too. God's omniscience does not negate human moral responsibility, because knowing an action does not mean causing it. And this view is shown in that teaching of St. Thomas Aquinas we looked at before. God is in the high citadel of eternity, which is all at one time. The whole course of time is subject to eternity in one simple glance. If humans act freely in accordance with their determined motivations, they can still also be held accountable for their choices. So this perspective allows for a belief in an all-knowing God while maintaining that humans are responsible for their actions, therefore resolving the potential conflict between divine foreknowledge and human freedom. So critical analysis of compatibilism. Compatibilism, of course, fits with how we actually think about responsibility. For example, if someone commits a crime because they wanted to, we tend to hold them responsible even if their desires were influenced by their upbringing or environment. Compatibilism is also consistent with science, as it redefines free will in a way that doesn't require the universe to be unpredictable. However, critics of compatibilism strongly argue that compatibilists have essentially changed the meaning of free will. Traditionally, free will might mean having the power to make a completely different choice, but compatibilists avoid this by saying that free will doesn't mean that. It just means to act upon your desires. Hard determinists would therefore critique and criticise compatibilism and argue that, again, it's only giving the illusion of freedom rather than the actual true meaning of free will. So there are two distinct approaches to crime and socially deviant behaviour. Firstly, we have the view that crime is a mental condition that can be treated, and secondly, that crime is a deliberately antisocial behaviour that should be punished. Now, both of these perspectives or approaches are helpful when we're considering the relevance of moral responsibility to reward and punishment. This is because the different perspectives on moral responsibility that we've just covered, hard determinism, libertarianism, and compatibilism, lead to different conclusions about how those who commit crime should be treated. Sometimes they will lead to the view that crime is something that should be treated rather than punished, but on other occasions it may be argued that crime is something that should be punished. So from the perspective of hard determinism, we are not free and cannot be held morally responsible for our actions, remember. From this perspective, therefore, essentially to punish those who commit crimes is kind of pointless. If human behaviour is determined, then criminal activities are determined. The system of reward and punishment is also determined. Clearly, this view has implications for Christianity, as it makes the concept of sinfulness actually incoherent. A key Christian theological belief is that Jesus died to atone for human sin, and that as a result, reward and eternal life with God in heaven is possible. If human behaviour is determined, however, then the doctrine of eternal reward and punishment, as explained by Jesus in the parable of the sheep and the goats, for example, literally makes no sense. Some Christians further believe that the omniscient God has predestined some people for heaven and some people for hell, but this also seems inconsistent with other ideas and beliefs about God being loving. The behavioural psychologist B.F. Skinner interestingly argued that to punish people for criminal actions cannot be effective, as at the conclusion of the punishment, people would go back to their original determined behaviour. As a solution, Skinner suggested a program of psychological conditioning to direct people to never act in such a way as to deserve punishment. And he highlighted the importance of social change to try and prevent people from turning to crime in the first place. So remember, the libertarian view is that we are free and morally responsible for our actions. Clearly, therefore, libertarians argue that people should be held to account for their actions, although they do recognise that there are some people who are not able to take full responsibility, such as children or those with cognitive impairment. Libertarians suggest that people who are found guilty, who are able to take full responsibility for their actions under the law, should be punished. This is because libertarians argue that although how people behave can be influenced by genetic, environmental, and psychological factors, ultimately, those who commit a crime could have chosen not to do so. Libertarians recognise the useful role that reward and punishment can play in influencing how people choose to act, as effective punishments can deter others from committing similar crimes. Remember, the compatibilist view is that some aspects of human beings are determined, but that we are morally responsible for our actions too. Compatibilism hinges on the idea that although some human behaviour is determined, people have the freedom to do otherwise. This means that people, of course, can be held responsible for their actions and should be punished if they break the law. As a compatibilist, the philosopher David Hume further suggested that reward and punishment should be used as tools to improve society. He reflected that rewards help develop positive characteristics and virtues, whereas punishments can help deter criminal behaviour.